In the following series of tutorials, we're going to be looking at the material system and some various shaders. We're going to start off by exploring the Mograph shaders. And in my experience, I've met a lot of people that find the actual principles behind the Mograph Color Shader a little bit confusing. So I thought the best thing to do here would just be to start at the basics, have a look at exactly how the Mograph Color Shader works. Once we've done that, we can move on and we'll look at some practical examples of how you might use that in some of your own projects. To follow along with this section, you need to open up the file lollipop start. And once you open that up, you will have a scene that looks like this. If you press Command and Control D, bring up your project settings, you can note that we have linear workflow here. This is enabled. That's quite important because when you're working with materials, whether or not you enable linear workflow has a big influence. If we just disable that, you can see how the look of our objects and our materials change. So we need to leave that enabled. In this scene, we also have a couple of materials here. Lolly stick, which has been applied to the lolly stick. We also have this material, which I've just put in as a placeholder to hold a gradient for us, so we don't have to rebuild that gradient. So if we come up and we select our lolly subdivision surfaces object and switch to the basic tab, under here we have this option, use color. This is quite handy because you can use this to enable a color on your object, and you can fold this down and you can view, you can change the color basically. You can set all your different objects to have different colors, pretty useful. You might note that I chose automatic for the use color option. There is also on and layer. If we choose layer, it's going to take the color from our layer. The difference between automatic and on is that if we choose automatic, it will display the color that you choose only if there isn't a material on that object. If we put a material on there, it will display the material. If you choose on, it's going to display that color regardless of the material or not. So it essentially overrides the material. So you might be thinking, what has this got to do with the Mograph shaders? Well, it's quite an important part of the shaders, because what the Mograph shaders do, or the Mograph Color Shader does and the multi-shader does, is it actually reads this display color, and it reads that display color, and then you can use that display color within your materials. Because of course, using this color here doesn't give you any control over the material. It's just the default material. You can't use this color in any of the other channels like transparency, reflection, etc. So that's where the Mograph Color Shader comes in. And it's a bit of a misconception that the Mograph Color Shader can only be used with the Mograph toolset, because you can use the Mograph Color Shader on any object at all. If we come down to the materials and create a new material, and let's call this one Lolly, and let's drag this on to our Lolly SDS. Okay, and you can see now that we can see that material. If we come back here under the basic tab, we choose on. You can see it overrides the material. Now we can change the color, show whatever color we want to. Let's just leave that at the default anyway. So I'm going to set that back to automatic so we can see the actual material. And if we come to this material and in the color channel, let's just choose texture and come to the Mograph submenu and choose a color shader. Now we've added the Mograph Color Shader, you can see it goes white. And the reason it's going white is because it's reading this color from here. If we change this, you can see that now the object changes accordingly. So we're using the Mograph Color Shader here, and it's reading the color from our display color and applying it to that material. Now the great thing about this is we could come in here and we could say add some transparency, and in the transparency we could use the Mograph Color Shader once again. Okay, and now when we render, we have this transparent blue, and it's reading it from here. You might be thinking, well, what's the point of that? Because we can just set that color in our material anyway. So we can set the color in here without using this shader. Well, the advantage of using the Mograph Color Shader is that we can use effectors to color our objects, and what the effectors essentially do is they change this display color. We then read that into our material. If it's not making sense, don't worry. I'm going to switch this off for now. Come to my material. Let's pull this down. Let's remove that shader from there and switch the transparency off. Now before we move on and add in some cloners and show how we can use the Mograph Color Shader with our Mograph effectors, etc., I just want to show you why you might use the Mograph Color Shader on a standard object. If we take this lollipop and just control drag to create a duplicate, let's just pull them separate. I'm just going to select both of these SDS, and actually I want to set this back to automatic. On this one here I'm going to set this just to be red, this pinky colour, and on this one here I'm going to set this to be blue. And you can see already that now what's happened is we have a blue and a pink lollipop, even though we're only using one material. So what you can essentially do is you could build one material, we could have some reflection on here, a little bit of transparency, and we could then manually create our various objects, set the display color just as I have here, and it means that you can create a variety of objects of different colors, all by using just one material. So that's the kind of flexibility of using the Mograph Color Shader, even without using any of the Mograph toolset. Okay, let's just get rid of that one for now. And let's set this to be off. So back to our default settings. I'm going to take this lollipop, hold down the Alt key, come up, and let's just add in a cloner object. Okay, and under the Object tab, set Y to be 0. I'm going to set the X amount to be, say, 3.5, and let's set the count to be 10. If we just press H to frame all of those. So now we've got a whole bunch of lollipops. With the cloner selected, switch to the Transform tab, and you notice in the Transform tab we have this color option. We can adjust this, and you can see it adjusts the actual color of our clones. What it's essentially doing is it's adjusting the display color just as before. So if we take our cloner and press C to make that editable and just fold this down, you can see that if I select these objects, you can see that the display color has been set to red. That's because the cloner was set to red and it's transforming the display color. That display color is then being read by the Mograph Color Shader. It's making that material red. So I'm just going to undo, so we're back to our cloner. And let's set this cloner under the Transform tab to be black. With that cloner selected, come to the Mograph menu, choose Effector. Let's just add in a plane effector. And under the Parameter tab, switch off position, and let's enable color mode. We can set that to on. So most of the effectors will use a grayscale value when we work with the color modes. The shader effector and the random effector are an exception to this. The random effector will introduce color, and the shader effector by default is white, but you can of course use shaders on it, so you can use any color you want. So the color mode is set to on. We can also choose user defined, in which case we end up with color picker just as before, and we can then adjust the color like so. And that's just the same as we would do it as if we were changing it within the cloner itself. Also note that we have a blending mode, so we can add, subtract, multiply and divide that color. So at the moment we have black as our base color, which the cloner has set, and then we're adding white to it. So default is that it just overrides, but we could choose to add on top. You could use multiple effectors, and you can then blend those colors together to create all sorts of effects. If we switch to the fall off tab, and let's just enable some linear fall off and set that to be along X, and now you can see that basically the fall off allows us to wipe that color on. So at this side here, where the effector isn't having any effect on our clones, they're the black color from the cloner, and on this side they're the white color from the plane effector. Pretty neat stuff. Let's just delete that plane effector, select the cloner. Let's just come up to the Mograph menu. This time we're going to add in a step effector. Okay, and by default that scales everything up, so let's switch that off, but let's set the color mode to be on. And again, it's going to introduce white. But you can see that now what it does, the step effector, because of course it increments its effect based on the index of the clone. And if we come and have a look, you can see that we have this graph here. If we grab this end and pull it down, oops, like so, you can see it doesn't have any effect. And if we obviously pull this up, then it's having the full effect all the way through. So we could, could create a curve like so, and that's just going to color the middle ones. Okay, let's right click on this spline here and just reset to the default. Come back down and select our lolly material. At the moment we just have our color shader in the color channel, and as you can see our effectors are creating these grayscale values. It'd be much more useful if we could use this with color, and the best way of doing that is to use a colorizer. The colorizer shader allows you to input a value and to output another value. It sounds a bit vague, but basically you can input a grayscale value and you can then map a gradient to that, so you can then map it to a color. So if we had like a red to blue gradient, it would look at the white value and it would make it blue, and it would look at the black value and it would make it red, and all the values in between would interpolate between the red and the blue. I've got this other material here, gradient. I've just done this so that it's so that we don't have to worry about drawing a gradient. If we just open this up and fold this tab down, and what we can do here is we can just choose to save this as a preset, because it's quite a nice candy coloured rainbow. Just choose save preset, and we'll call this rainbow. Okay. I've already got one called rainbow. I'm going to override it. Okay. And if we come to our lolly now and our color shader, so what we want to do is we want to put this as our input. So we're going to click on this little arrow and choose colorizer. If we open that up, you can see that it's going to take the luminance value or the brightness of that color shader. So in other words, it's going to look at the grayscale value, and then it's going to map it to this gradient that we have here. So where it's white at this end, it's yellow, and where it's black, it's mapped to the black, and in the middle, it's red. Fold this gradient down. Let's choose load preset. I've got a few in here. I'm going to choose rainbow, like so. And there we go. And now you can see that it's mapping the colors from our gradient. And the reason I wanted to do it like this was A, to show you that you can use colors with the Mograph Color Shader. So now you can see we've got all these candy colored lollies, and we're still only using one material, and we only have one object in the cloner. But you might notice there's a little bit of a discrepancy because we're using the step effector, and when we were looking at the grayscale values, it looked like it went from black through to white as a nice linear gradient, but it isn't. You can see that we've got all of these blue lollies, and then we've got green, one yellow, and two red. So the distribution seems a little bit out of whack. We look at the spline, and you can see that it kind of eases here and it eases here. So really what we need to do is we need to set this as a linear spline. So we can right click on here and choose spline presets linear. Okay, and you can notice that did change the colors slightly, but again we still don't have an even distribution. So you might be wondering why it's doing that and why it's not behaving as we expect it to. So we could fold down the minimum maximum here and make sure that our minimum is set to 0. You know, that maybe that was at -100. That would make some weird adjustment there. That probably wouldn't actually do that. But the reason it's like this is actually because we're using linear workflow, and I'm not going to go into the ins and outs of linear workflow now. If you want to understand how that works, if you go to helloluxx.com and search for linear workflow, there's an article there that explains it. It's basically to do with the gamma adjustment and the curve that's introduced with linear workflow. An easy way of showing this is if I create a new material under the color channel. Let's just add in a simple gradient. Okay, and if we open that up, you can see that there's a lot of white and not very much black. And that's the curve from linear workflow being introduced. And if I just pop that over as a separate attribute manager, let's just come back to our material. Let's switch to the bump channel, grab this color gradient, drop that into the bump channel. Okay, and then open that up, and there we go, and you can see the difference. So in the bump channel, linear workflow is ignored, so we get a standard. If we set this to be linear, then it really is a linear gradient. We set this one to be linear, you can really see it. You can see that you know, the black end is really squashed up at this end, and there's a lot of whites, and that's to do with the curve. Here you can see that the distribution is even. That's because there's no linear workflow being used in the bump channel, but in the color channel there is. And when we use linear workflow, let's delete that material. when we have linear workflow enabled in our project settings, it does affect things like this, which in my opinion is wrong. It shouldn't do that. The step effector shouldn't take the linear workflow into account, or it should at least have an option to disable it, because this distribution based on the step effector and this graph should in fact be linear across, but it isn't. So there's two things you can do. You can come to the project settings, you can disable linear workflow. Okay, so we've disabled linear workflow. Now you can see that distribution is perfect. We've got two of each color from that rainbow. But the problem is, of course, is that now we've got linear workflow disabled. And honestly, I would always recommend using linear workflow because it just makes your lighting and your renders look so much nicer. So let's just enable that. The other option is to try and produce the inverse curve with the step effector. Now, isn't that easy to actually do this 100% accurately, but at the end of the day we can just approximate it, because I mean it's all about what it looks like really. It's not about necessarily being mathematically perfect. If we just right click and reset this to default, just so we've got these handles again, we can grab this and pull this up a bit and maybe just curve like so, and you can see that kind of getting there. There we go, almost. Maybe just pull that up a tiny bit more, and you can see it's a little bit fiddly. And yeah, you can see obviously it's not an exact science. I think problem's up here actually. We need to just pull that down. There we go. I mean that looks almost right. This one's going a tiny bit green. That must be just on the border. So maybe we just pull that down slightly. There we go. Okay, so I've kind of made this curve. We could of course show this in a separate window, and you know, give us a bit more of an opportunity to create that curve. Not exactly ideal, Maxon. Hopefully you'll change that in the future, but that gives you an understanding of how the color shader works, how you can map it over colors, and why you don't necessarily get the result you're looking for because of linear workflow. The great thing about this is that now we've got this, we understand this, we can use this in our materials. So if we select this, and we can copy this, for instance, and we could come to the basic tab, and let's enable Luminance, for instance. Come here and paste this in. Maybe drop this into a layer shader. Open this up. Let's add in something like a Fresnel. Multiply that over the top. And come back here. Let's just set the brightness of that down low and maybe put this to about 25. You know, and now if we just switch our color channel off, you can see we're just getting this little glow around the edge. Whoops, there we go. And if we render that now, you can see that that's working. It's giving us a sort of tiny bit of a fake subsurface effect. Of course, if we wanted to, we can come to our reflectance. Let's just add in some Beckman, and if we come down to the layer color, we can paste that into there as well. And let's just fold these up and add in a little bit of a Fresnel here as well. We'll just use dielectric. And that just gives us a nice little bit of a reflection, but on our blue lollies we're going to get slightly blue reflection, and on our red ones we're going to get a slightly red reflection. So the advantages of using the Mograph Color Shader means that you can create quite complicated materials, but you can then have only one material and create multiple colored objects. So it's really, really nice and versatile. In the material manager, we can just control drag to duplicate this, and let's call this lolly clear, and perhaps if we just control drag to create a duplicate lolly, and I'm going to put this lolly clear onto this second one. Okay, and the only difference on here is I'm going to just come to the basic tab, enable transparency. Let's set that to be, say, 1.8, and let's paste that colorizer in there as well. Now we're getting colored transparency, which is also based on our gradient. Maybe we want to just bring the color down on this to be dark and get rid of some of the color here in our color channel. Like so. Maybe bring the luminance down a little bit as well. You know, now when we render, you can see that we've got some transparent lollies as well. We could take this and let's just make another one. There's something else that I wanted to show you, which is a bit of a a gotcha. Let's call this one lolly stripes. Okay, and once again, let's duplicate this, and this second one, I'm going to add this lolly stripes to it. Okay, and what I want to do here is come to my color channel, and I'm going to take this colorizer and drop this into a layer shader. As soon as I do this, you can notice that it changes here. So we're not seeing the effect of our Mograph Color Shader now. They're all looking red. If we undo, you can see that they're actually showing the color. But you might already have noticed that, because these blue ones have got this red tint. And that red tint is coming from our Luminance, because in the Luminance we're using the layer shader. And unfortunately, it's a limitation that if we use the Mograph Color Shader and a colorizer, and if we put that into the layer shader, unfortunately, it may work, it may not, it depends on your graphics card, but I think it's a limitation, and it doesn't show up under OpenGL, which is a bit of a shame. But we know that if we render that, it's going to look correct. So don't always rely on what you see in the editor. Sometimes you need to render it to make sure it's actually working correctly. But I wanted to just bring this up, and I'm going to add in a gradient. Open this up. I'm going to create some stripes. So I'm going to set the gradient to be 2D radial. Let's control drag this black and just pull this along. And then let's put this white one over here. And control drag the white one. Let's control drag the black again. And then once again do this. Okay, and a little trick here is if you come up, if you really want to get in close on your gradients, what you can do is you can just open up a new attribute manager, put it right over to the side of your screen, and then just drag it all the way across. And then you can actually, you know, get in and really fine tune the position of these knots. So I'm just really going to do this pretty roughly, just nice and quick. Okay, and we only need to create a few, because once we've got some of them on here that are more or less evenly distributed, although they're probably not that even, but you know, when you're making lollies, I don't think the result is always even. But obviously I've never worked in a lolly factory. Okay, so there we go. And then what we can do is we can right click on here and we can choose double knots, and we can choose double knots, and that looks pretty good. Okay, so let's just close that down. Let's just add like a little bit of turbulence to this, maybe a bit more, 10, something like so. I think the scale is wrong, and there's too much detail, so let's check the octaves to 2, and the scale to about 50. So we just get these wobbly lines, and you can see there we go on the lollipop. Probably would have been nicer if they're a bit thinner, but never mind. And we can just set that to be screen, say. So now we've got these stripy lollies, but as I said before, you know, you can't see the various colours. Let's just copy that and come back over to our Luminance channel, open this up, and we can paste. Paste that channel there, and we can then screen that on top of the Luminance as well, like so. And there we go. And to be honest, that probably wants to just go under there, just so that the Fresnel multiplies on top of that gradient. So now you can see, using the color shader, we've got all of these variations. We've created some pretty simple materials, but hopefully it helps you understand how this shader works. Now the last thing I wanted to show you with this lollipop scene is if we take this lolly stripes and let's just duplicate this, and what I'm going to do now is we're going to build it in a slightly different way. Let's come into the color channel, come in here, and let's copy that colorizer. Let's come back out, and let's just clear that. And instead we're going to use Fusion. Now Fusion is an older shader. It's very similar to the layer shader, but it only allows you to use 2 inputs. So for the base channel, let's paste in our colorizer. Now we need to grab the gradient. So if we just open a new attribute manager again, we don't need it quite that big this time. Notice that it locks the new attribute manager. So now we can come back to our other material here. We can come in here and copy that gradient, and then we can just paste that straight in over here like so, and then we can set the blending mode here to be screen. Okay, so we'll come back to our lolly stripes. So now we've got that in our color channel. Let's copy this fusion shader. Come to the luminance and let's paste that into there. Okay, and then what we need to do is we need to put that into another fusion. So we're kind of putting a fusion inside a fusion. When we open that up, it doesn't actually let you do that. Okay, so let's just come in here. Let's just paste that in to there. And instead of the gradient here, we want to have our Fresnel, and we just want to multiply that on top, like so. Okay, and there we go, and we're back to where we were before. And if we now take this material here, which is using fusion, let's just call this Lolly Stripes Fusion, and zoom out. Let's just drag and drop that onto here. Okay, and there you go, and you can see the difference. So now, when we use Fusion, we can actually see the result in the editor. So the difference is that the layer shader doesn't show the Mograph Color Shader in the editor under OpenGL, and the Fusion shader does. But of course, the layer shader allows us to add in lots of layers, much easier to manage. The Fusion shader is a bit awkward when you need more than 2 layers, because you have to start embedding fusions. So then you have to go up and down all the different shaders to make any adjustments. So you know, there's a bit of a disadvantage there. If you've only got a couple of layers, then Fusion is perfect for it. But if you've got 6 or 7, then it could be a bit of a nightmare diving in and out. But you can see that using Fusion gives us exactly the same result if you set it up correctly. But of course, we can see that result in the editor. We can see what we're going to get when we render.